Faith in God is often tested in the crucible of human suffering. Many individuals, especially those enduring deep pain, struggle with reconciling the existence of a good and all-powerful God with the reality of evil, suffering, and injustice in the world. It is a problem that has plagued the minds of believers and non-believers alike for centuries. In this first section, we delve into the age-old question, how can a loving and omnipotent God allow suffering? This question is not only philosophical, it is intensely personal for many individuals who experience pain in various forms. Pain, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, forces individuals to confront the deepest parts of their faith, and in those moments, doubt may begin to seep in. When life's difficulties mount, whether the loss of a loved one, personal failure, or the weight of injustice, believers often wonder where God is in the midst of their suffering. C.S. Lewis, in his famous book, The Problem of Pain, offers a profound insight into this dilemma. He writes, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world." For Lewis, suffering is not evidence that God does not exist, but rather a tool through which he engages with his creation. Pain, then, is not a sign of God's absence, but of his presence, drawing us nearer, helping us become aware of the deeper purposes he might have for our lives. This is an important aspect of the Christian worldview. Faith is not about an absence of suffering, but about trusting God in the midst of it. The Bible does not shy away from acknowledging pain. In fact, it paints a realistic picture of human existence, filled with suffering, while simultaneously offering hope through the lens of divine redemption. Scriptures like Romans 8:18 remind us, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." This understanding does not trivialize suffering. It acknowledges it deeply, but places it in a broader narrative of hope. In the Christian tradition, faith is often presented not as an escape from pain, but as a means to transcend it. It is through suffering that a deeper relationship with God can emerge. The Psalms, for example, offer a raw, unfiltered look at human pain and suffering, with David often crying out to God in moments of despair. Yet these same Psalms are filled with declarations of trust, despite the anguish. Psalm 34:18 tells us, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." It's a reminder that suffering does not separate us from God. In fact, it draws us closer to his presence. This is where faith takes root, not in the absence of suffering, but in the midst of it. The believer is called not to deny their pain, but to bring it to God, trusting that he is good even when the world feels dark. Faith becomes the act of choosing to believe in God's goodness, even when it seems to defy reason. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis further elaborates on the paradox of suffering and faith. Faith is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted, in spite of your changing moods. It is in these moments, when our moods shift and our circumstances worsen, that faith must be grounded in something deeper than just understanding. It is rooted in trust. Trust in the character of God, who is sovereign, loving, and always at work, even when we cannot see it. So in addressing the problem of pain, we begin not with answers, but with the invitation to wrestle. The act of wrestling with God, with our doubts, and with our suffering is in itself an act of faith. God does not expect us to have all the answers, but he desires us to come to him, raw and vulnerable, with our questions. Just as Jesus welcomed Thomas's doubts, inviting him to touch his wounds in order to believe, God welcomes our honest struggles with faith. He does not abandon us in the wilderness of suffering. Rather, he walks with us, guiding us, and offering his presence as a source of comfort and strength. This section sets the stage for the exploration of how doubt, pain, and faith interact in the life of a believer. It challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about suffering and to look for deeper meanings in our struggles. The journey of faith, as Lewis suggests, is not about avoiding pain, but about finding God in the midst of it. As we move forward in our exploration of suffering and faith, we now turn to the search for answers. The question of why suffering exists is one that many believers grapple with, often leading them on a deep, sometimes painful journey of seeking understanding. In this pursuit, it is crucial to recognize that there are no simple answers. The world of pain and suffering is complex, and no intellectual or theological explanation can fully remove the weight of the reality we experience. Yet, it is in this search for meaning that faith and knowledge intersect. When we are confronted by suffering, especially when it strikes unexpectedly or without explanation, our first instinct is often to seek clarity. Why is this happening to me? Why would a good God allow this? These questions are not only natural, but they reflect a deep longing for order and justice in the midst of chaos. In the Bible, we see characters like Job, who question God directly about his suffering, demanding answers. Job's story is a compelling one because it encapsulates the very human need to understand and make sense of pain. Job's friends, who attempt to explain his suffering in a way that fits their worldview, fail to offer him the comfort he seeks. It is only when God speaks directly to Job, not offering simple answers, but revealing his grandeur and sovereignty, that Job finds peace. The search for answers does not always result in immediate or clear explanations, but it can lead to a deeper awareness of God's presence and his ultimate purposes. This pursuit often requires an openness to mystery. C.S. Lewis, in his writings, emphasizes that human beings are finite and limited in their understanding. He writes in Mere Christianity, "We are not necessarily meant to understand why things happen, but to trust that God knows what he is doing." This statement encapsulates a vital component of the Christian faith, the willingness to trust in God's wisdom, even when it transcends our understanding. It is important to note that God is not offended by our questions. In fact, the Bible encourages inquiry and dialogue. In Proverbs 2:3-6, we are told, "Indeed, if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God." This passage demonstrates that the search for understanding is both valued and encouraged in Scripture. It reminds us that seeking knowledge and wisdom from God is an active pursuit, one that involves humility and a recognition of our limitations. Yet, the quest for answers is not merely intellectual. It is also deeply relational. When we search for answers in the midst of suffering, we are also searching for God himself. The answers we seek may not come in the way we expect, but the very act of seeking draws us closer to him. In this sense, suffering becomes a pathway to intimacy with God. As we wrestle with our doubts and questions, we open ourselves to deeper levels of trust and dependence. We find that God does not always provide easy or immediate answers, but he offers his presence as the ultimate answer. This is where faith intersects with suffering, not in the absence of questions, but in the trust that God's presence is enough, even without all the answers. C.S. Lewis also emphasizes the importance of perspective when dealing with suffering. In The Problem of Pain, he writes that we must understand suffering within the broader context of God's eternal plan. He suggests that from a human perspective, suffering often seems meaningless or unjust, but from the vantage point of an eternal God, it can be part of a greater story that is beyond our comprehension. In his words, the problem of pain is that it is not a mere result of human actions, but a part of a cosmic reality that calls for a response to God's design. The Christian response to suffering is not one of passive resignation, but one of active engagement with God. We search for answers not as a way to control or explain everything, but as a means of drawing closer to the one who is ultimately in control. The search for answers should not be viewed merely as an intellectual exercise, but as a spiritual journey. In this journey, we may not always find the answers we hope for, but we will encounter the God who promises to be near to the brokenhearted, Psalm 34:18. And so, while suffering invites us to ask difficult questions, it also invites us into a deeper relationship with God. It is through this relationship that we begin to understand the nature of our pain, not as an isolated event, but as part of the larger story of God's redemptive work in the world. Through faith, we begin to see that the search for answers is not just about understanding why we suffer, but about discovering who God is in the midst of it all. As we journey through life, grappling with questions, pain, and uncertainty, we are invited to embrace the fullness of God's will for our lives. This final part of our exploration is not just about understanding the abstract concepts of faith, trust, and suffering. It is about a practical, intentional response to God's call, which involves surrendering our will to His and aligning our lives with His purpose. This is the ultimate expression of faith, choosing to walk in God's will, even when it leads us into unknown territories. The Bible consistently calls us to surrender ourselves fully to God. Romans 12:1-2 urges us to offer our bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, which is our true and proper worship. This means more than just passive acceptance of God's will. It involves an active decision to live according to His purposes, rather than our own. It is a daily commitment to trust Him, even when it's hard, and to follow Him, even when the path seems uncertain. In Matthew 16:24, Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." This call to discipleship is not one of ease, but one of total surrender, a willingness to give up control and trust that God's way is ultimately the best way. C.S. Lewis often spoke about the necessity of surrendering our will to God. In his book, The Problem of Pain, he wrote, "God's love is not a feeling, but a choice to will the best for us, even when it involves suffering." Lewis understood that God's plan for our lives may not always align with our desires, but it is always for our good. Our call, then, is to trust that God's love is greater than our own understanding and to willingly submit to His will. It's about learning to recognize that our lives are not our own, but are part of a much greater story, a story of redemption and restoration that God is writing. One of the most profound ways we can embrace God's will is by finding peace and contentment in our current circumstances, even when we cannot understand them. Philippians 4:11-13 speaks of the secret to contentment. "I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through Him who gives me strength." This contentment does not come from our circumstances, but from our trust in God's power to sustain us through all things. Embracing God's will involves trusting that He is enough, no matter what we face. In embracing God's will, we also learn to see our suffering and struggles through a new lens. Pain and hardship are not just things to endure or escape from. They can be opportunities to grow in faith and draw nearer to God. James 1:2-4 encourages believers to consider it pure joy when facing trials, knowing that the testing of faith produces perseverance, which in turn leads to spiritual maturity. Through suffering, God shapes us, refines us, and helps us grow into the people He created us to be. Even when we cannot see the good in the moment, we can trust that God is working in us and through us. Finally, embracing God's will for our lives leads us to the most important call to action of all, to share the hope of Christ with others. Once we understand the depth of God's love for us, the truth of His sovereignty, and the peace He offers in the midst of suffering, we are called to go and make disciples of all nations. Matthew 28:19. Our journey of faith is not just about us. It is about joining God in His mission to bring hope and redemption to a broken world. As we embrace God's will for our lives, we are called to be His hands and feet in the world, offering His love and hope to those who are still lost in darkness. A call to action. Now, as we conclude, I invite you to take the next step in embracing God's will for your life. This may look different for each person, whether it's surrendering a particular area of your life to Him, stepping out in faith to follow His calling, or finding peace in the midst of suffering. But whatever it is, remember that God is with you. He is faithful, He is good, and He has a purpose for you that is greater than anything you could ever imagine. Take a moment to reflect on your own life. What areas of your life are you holding on to, unwilling to surrender? Are there questions or struggles that have caused you to doubt or question God's goodness? What would it look like for you to embrace His will for your life today? I challenge you to take a step of faith. Begin by praying, asking God to help you trust Him in new ways. Surrender those areas of control and invite His peace into your heart. Take action, whether it's serving others, sharing your story, or seeking His will in a specific situation. Remember, God is not asking for perfection, but for obedience and trust. And as you take that step, Know that He is walking with you, leading you into a life of greater faith, deeper peace, and unshakable hope. God is calling you to something greater than yourself. Will you answer the call? Will you embrace His will for your life, even when it leads you into the unknown? Trust Him, for He is faithful. And as you step out in faith, you will find that He is with you every step of the way, leading you into a life of purpose, joy, and eternal hope.